It was late, later than I'd usually stay out, but the night had slipped away in the easy company of friends. We'd spent hours watching movies, lost in the glow of the screen, until I glanced at the clock and saw it was nearing 1 a.m. I hadn't expected to be on the road alone at this hour, driving through the dark, winding streets that led out of my friend's neighborhood and toward the long, empty stretch home. The world around me felt different at night, as if the familiar streets had taken on a darker, more sinister quality in the absence of daylight. My gaslight blinked on, a sharp reminder that I'd need to make a stop before I could get home. My stomach twisted at the thought. I'd had my share of uncomfortable encounters before, the kind of attention I tried to avoid whenever I could. Alone at this hour on a deserted road, my nerves were already on edge. But there was no other option. I'd have to find a gas station, and soon. It didn't take long to find a station, bright and isolated, like a lone beacon in the dark stretch of road. Relief washed over me as I pulled in, the lights offering a thin layer of comfort, but I couldn't shake the unease simmering beneath the surface. I kept my eyes on the station as I stepped out, taking in the surroundings, alert to any signs of movement. While I pumped gas, my attention caught on a man emerging from the store, a cigarette hanging from his lips. He stood there, a shadow among the light, watching me intently. His gaze felt invasive, a cold prickle that made me want to shrink away. I felt exposed, aware of every inch of the empty lot around me. My instincts kicked in, reminding me to stay cautious, to keep a watchful eye. He didn't approach, just stood there with an air of casual disinterest, but his gaze was enough to set my nerves alight. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself he was just another customer, nothing more. But deep down, I knew I'd need to stay alert, keep my distance, and get out of there as quickly as possible. Just as I thought I'd be able to leave without incident, the pump clicked off abruptly, refusing to dispense any more gas. Frustration bubbled up, but I forced myself to stay focused, moving to another pump in hopes of finishing quickly. I could feel his eyes still on me, a quiet persistence that made every nerve in my body hum with awareness. He hadn't moved, still smoking and watching, as though he were waiting for something. My mind raced through possibilities. I tried to shake off the thoughts, forcing myself to focus on the task, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that I was somehow vulnerable, alone in this pool of light surrounded by darkness. When the pump finally cooperated, I finished up and hurried back to my car, my movements deliberate yet tense. I could feel the unease growing with each step, my instinct warning me to get inside, lock the doors, and leave as fast as I could. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors immediately, the familiar click bringing a fleeting sense of relief. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the mirrors, and caught sight of him again. This time, he was moving toward my car, his slow stride laced with an eerie confidence. I felt trapped, the walls of the car closing in as I watched him approach. He stopped by my driver's side window, leaning down, a polite but unsettling smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I didn't dare roll down the window, instinct telling me to keep every barrier I had in place. Instead, I rolled down the passenger side window just a crack, enough to keep some distance while showing I was listening. He asked for a ride, his voice smooth, casual, as though this were a normal request. He claimed his car had broken down nearby, his tone edging toward insistence when I hesitated. But there was something about him, something in his gaze and his manner, that felt wrong. My instinct screamed for me to refuse, to trust the unease gnawing at my stomach. When I turned him down, his expression darkened, shifting from friendly to something sharper, colder. He gripped the door handle, yanking at it, the locked door barely holding against his force. I could feel my pulse spike, my hand fumbling for the gear shift, realizing I needed to act fast. Without a second thought, I threw the car into gear and sped off, my heart pounding as I left him behind. The road blurred as I sped away, but even as the gas station lights faded into the distance, I couldn't shake the image of his face, the anger that flashed in his eyes when I denied him a ride. My mind replayed the way he'd pulled at my door handle, his fingers curling around it, testing the lock with a force that made my skin crawl. His expression had transformed in that split second, shifting from polite to something twisted, an impatience that had left me shaken. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, expecting to see his silhouette behind me. My thoughts raced, grasping at every warning sign I'd felt, each of them now a clear sign that something was deeply wrong. I knew, without a doubt, that his story was a lie, a thinly veiled excuse for something far more sinister. The realization made me sick to my stomach, a nausea born from the knowledge of how close I'd come to letting him into my car. I kept driving, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the gas station, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The adrenaline from the encounter was still coursing through me, making each passing second feel both fleeting and painfully slow. I checked my phone, the impulse to call for help taking over, but I hesitated, my mind clouded by the shock of what had happened. Just then, headlights appeared behind me, a pair of bright, glaring lights that seemed to materialize from the darkness. Panic flared in my chest as I watched the car draw closer, the blinding lights illuminating my rearview mirror. My thoughts spiraled, wondering if it was him, if he'd managed to get back on the road and was now following me. I pressed harder on the gas, the car's engine revving as I pushed it to its limits. The fear took hold, urging me forward, my pulse racing as the headlights remained close behind, mirroring my every move. I took sharp turns, trying to shake them off, but the lights stayed with me, a relentless presence that made each second feel like an eternity. My mind raced through escape plans, every instinct telling me to get to safety, to find somewhere with people, with lights, anywhere that would pull me out of his reach. Finally, I spotted an exit leading to a more populated area, the faint glow of streetlights visible on the horizon. I took the turn sharply, my heart hammered in my chest as I pulled into a space near the entrance of a 24-hour diner, the warm glow of the building a stark contrast to the darkness I'd left behind. I threw the car into park, my fingers trembling as I clutched the steering wheel, feeling the safety of the well-lit area surround me. I sat there, my eyes locked on the entrance as I tried to calm my breathing. A few moments later, the headlights that had been following me slowed down but didn't enter the lot, continuing down the road instead. I watched them fade into the distance, a wave of relief washing over me as I realized I was safe, at least for the moment. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my body, replaced by a lingering unease. I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that he'd been following me, that his intentions were darker than he'd let on. But for now, I was safe, surrounded by people and light, far from the darkness of that isolated gas station. After a few minutes, I pulled out my phone and dialed the police, recounting the incident as best as I could with the details I remembered. My voice trembled as I described the man, the lies about his broken-down car, and the way he'd tried to pull open my door. I shared everything, my thoughts racing as I relived the close call, hoping that somehow they'd be able to do something. The officer on the other end listened attentively, asking for the name of the gas station and any identifying details. They assured me they'd review the security footage, and the next day they followed up. The cameras had captured everything. They confirmed that the man had left shortly after I did, climbing into his own red SUV, his story about a broken-down car just a lie, a trap I'd narrowly escaped. The confirmation brought a hollow relief, a vindication that my instincts had been right, that I'd sensed the danger lurking behind his polite mask. But it didn't erase the fear, the lingering unease that clung to me long after the call ended. I'd been lucky that night, lucky to trust my instincts, to act quickly before his intentions could unfold. I've always found some comfort in my isolated countryside home, a solid 20 miles from the nearest city, with a 24/7 gas station just a few minutes away. It's been my routine to stop there on occasional late nights, especially when I want a quick snack without having to deal with busy streets or crowded shops. Last Saturday was no different, or so I thought. Around midnight, I decided to head over for a pack of peanuts, expecting a quiet, uneventful stop. The gas station lot had one car parked outside, a sight I'd seen countless times before. It was a relief, almost reassuring. No one lingers at a gas station this late unless they have a reason, and one lone car was as ordinary as it could get out here. But when I stepped inside, something felt off. The silence was immediate and complete. No humming of machines, no faint shuffling from the aisles. There wasn't a soul in sight. The counter, usually manned by the same cashier who'd nod at me in recognition, was empty. I glanced around, thinking maybe he'd just stepped away for a moment, but the place felt deserted. I called out once, then again, but no response came back. Each second stretched longer as I stood there, my voice seemingly swallowed by the empty store. My eyes flicked from corner to corner, hoping for some movement or sound, anything that would explain the absence. There was nothing. The station had turned from a simple late-night pit stop into something else, something that sent an unease trickling down my spine. Trying not to overthink it, I decided to check the aisles and glance around back. Still, I found no sign of anyone. The silence was suffocating. I left quickly, stepping outside and taking a deep breath, eager to be away from the unsettling emptiness. Once outside, I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the keypad, as I debated whether this warranted a call to the police. A gas station left empty in the dead of night. The thought alone was eerie enough, and I couldn't shake the unsettling quiet from inside. Finally, I dialed, explaining to the dispatcher that I'd just been inside the station, found no one, and hadn't seen the cashier anywhere. 10 or 15 minutes later, the police arrived. I waited near my car, watching the officers head into the gas station, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They moved purposefully. My pulse was steady, but my thoughts kept returning to that emptiness I'd felt inside, that strange, unnatural quiet. After a few minutes of tense waiting, I saw one of the officers emerge, signaling to me to stay put as they spoke quietly with their colleagues. Then came the real shock. One officer came over, his expression tense, and informed me they'd found the cashier, unconscious and beaten in the men's bathroom. The attack had been brutal, enough to leave the man completely out cold. I struggled to process it, feeling a wave of disbelief at how close I had been to whatever had happened there. The gas station I'd trusted as a safe, routine spot had turned into a scene of violence, and I had unwittingly walked right into its aftermath. The thought twisted inside me, a realization that I'd narrowly missed something dark. As the police continued their investigation, I found myself hovering on the edge, unsure whether to stay or go. An officer gave me a brief nod, indicating I could leave, but a part of me felt rooted to the spot. The thought of what could have happened replayed over and over. I had walked in mere moments after someone had carried out a violent attack and left without a trace. The questions began to pile up in my mind. Why had they attacked the cashier? Why leave so quickly? After a short conversation with the police, I learned they were checking security footage from the station to try to identify the attacker. Their process was methodical, and I admired the calm efficiency they displayed in the face of this unexpected violence. But the encounter had left a strange discomfort in me, something I couldn't quite shake. I began to feel that whatever happened there might be part of something larger, something I had unknowingly brushed against. Finally, I decided to head home, feeling both relieved to leave and troubled by the strange turn my night had taken. As I drove, the darkness seemed to cling to the road, the headlights of my car only illuminating small patches ahead. The unease grew heavier as I approached my driveway. I told myself it was just nerves, the aftershock of an unnerving experience, but the feeling only intensified as I neared the house. I pulled into the driveway, turning off the engine and sitting in the quiet of the car for a moment. My mind was racing with thoughts of the gas station and the cashier left battered in the bathroom. I shook off the feeling, opened the car door, and stepped out, scanning my yard instinctively. That's when I noticed my dog, usually inside at this hour, standing near the front porch, staring in my direction. It was odd. He rarely wandered outside on his own, especially at night. Walking closer, I felt a jolt of shock as I saw the front door ajar, hanging slightly off its frame. The sight was unsettling, as though the home I knew had been breached by something foreign. I approached cautiously, stepping inside and finding the entryway dim, untouched, yet somehow wrong. The space felt colder, less familiar. I moved from room to room, expecting some sign of theft or destruction, but everything was eerily intact. No valuables disturbed, no drawers rifled through, only the unsettling silence that mirrored what I'd encountered at the gas station. After a few more minutes of searching, I stepped back outside, joining my dog, who remained vigilant on the porch. My mind began piecing together the events, a disturbing thought forming. Whoever had attacked the cashier might have followed me home. They had entered my house, only to leave without a trace of their presence. The idea lodged itself in my mind, twisting deeper with each passing moment. I called the police once more, reporting the break-in, hoping they might find something I'd missed. The next day, my brother, who worked for the sheriff's office, called me with news. His voice was steady, but there was a subtle edge to it, a hesitation that told me whatever he had to say would only add to the darkness lingering from the night before. He explained that they'd reviewed the security footage from the gas station, and what they found confirmed my worst suspicions. According to the footage, the man who had attacked the cashier had slipped out the back exit only moments before I entered the store. The timing was unnervingly close. I had been on the verge of encountering him myself. But that wasn't the worst part. After leaving the gas station, the man had walked down the road, disappearing in the direction of my house. The footage captured his figure heading into the night, footsteps aimed at the very place I called home. A cold understanding settled over me as I listened. The break-in, the open door, my dog outside, it had all been connected to the attacker's flight from the scene. I felt a dull weight settle in my chest, knowing how narrowly we'd escaped something worse. My wife had been out that night, sparing her from whatever intentions this man might have harbored. It was only after hearing the full account that I felt the true gravity of how fortunate we'd been. With that final, unsettling piece in place, I took steps to protect our home. I installed a security system, one with cameras, alarms, and sensors that would prevent any silent approach or unknown figure from slipping into the night. There was no relief, just the knowledge that I could never again leave things as they were, not after that night. And with each glance at the now secured front door, I was reminded that my own routine had nearly brought me face to face with a stranger's violent path. Working the graveyard shift at the gas station had always been a quiet, almost meditative experience. The roads were nearly empty, and I could count on one hand the number of customers who came in during a shift. It was a rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, the comforting hum of fluorescent lights, the steady tick of the clock marking the hours as I swept, stocked shelves, and prepared coffee for the early risers. The stillness was both a blessing and a curse. Most nights, it felt like I had the world to myself, the gas station a lone outpost in the silence of the night. But there was an undercurrent to those quiet hours, an awareness that came with working alone in an empty place while the rest of the world slept. The solitude had a way of heightening every sound, every creak in the floor or tap of the wind against the windows, a reminder that I was alone in this small, fluorescent-lit corner of the world. At 31, I'd grown used to the solitude, finding a certain peace in the routine. But that night, something felt different, an unease lingering just beneath the surface, as though the silence held a hidden weight I couldn't quite place. Earlier that evening, a man had wandered into the store. He was disheveled, his clothes rumpled, and he swayed slightly as he moved, his eyes unfocused as he mumbled to himself. He looked around with a kind of aimless curiosity, as if he weren't entirely sure where he was. I watched him from behind the counter, wary but polite, as he shuffled through the aisles, touching items but never picking anything up. There was something unsettling about him, a strangeness in the way he moved, his gestures slow and disconnected. When he finally approached the counter, he looked at me with a bleary gaze, saying nothing but holding my stare for a moment too long. He swayed slightly, muttering under his breath before turning and stumbling out of the store, disappearing into the shadows beyond the parking lot. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just another late-night customer, nothing more. But as the night went on, his image lingered in my mind, a sense of discomfort settling in. Something about him had felt wrong, a feeling I couldn't shake, though I did my best to push it aside as I returned to my routine. Around 3:30 a.m., as I was taking a break outside, a cigarette in hand, I saw him again. He was across the street near the sheriff's office, barely illuminated by the streetlights, but his figure was unmistakable. He was swaying, stumbling as he muttered to himself, his voice carrying faintly through the silence. The sight of him brought back the unease I'd felt earlier, a prickle of apprehension that made me stand a little straighter, more aware of my surroundings. I kept my distance, watching him from the edge of the parking lot, hoping he'd stay on the other side of the street. But he seemed oblivious to everything around him, caught up in some private world as he gestured and mumbled, his movements erratic and unpredictable. A flicker of fear crossed my mind, but I told myself to stay calm. This was just another night, another stranger passing through. Nothing to worry about. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow drawn to this place. His presence an intrusion on the quiet comfort I usually found in these hours. I finished my cigarette, keeping my eye on him, a silent hope that he'd wander off and leave me to the familiar solitude of my shift. A few minutes later, a car pulled up, and a customer stepped out, a middle-aged man who'd stopped by a few times before. He glanced over his shoulder as he walked toward the door, his gaze lingering on the man across the street before he looked at me with a frown. "Be careful out here," he said, his voice low, a note of concern evident in his tone. I gave him a small smile, shrugging it off with a casual response, making light of the situation, even as his words sent a shiver down my spine. He laughed, but his eyes held a seriousness that reminded me of my own unease. As he left, I couldn't help but glance back across the street, my gaze catching on the man's shadowy figure. He was still there, swaying in place, his murmurs carrying faintly across the road. I tried to brush off the fear, telling myself I was overreacting, but the customer's warning echoed in my mind, deepening the sense of vulnerability that had begun to creep in. The quiet felt heavier now, an oppressive weight that settled over the parking lot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. My gaze lingered on the man as he continued to drift closer, my pulse quickening with each step he took. As he started to cross the street, an alarm bell rang loud in my mind. The way he moved, slow but purposeful, made my instincts kick in, and without a second thought, I slipped back inside and locked the doors behind me. I turned the lock with a steady hand, but inside, my heart was pounding. The man, still swaying slightly, reached the edge of the parking lot, his gaze locked on the store. I didn't dare let my guard down, watching him carefully from behind the glass. He stopped at the door, peering in as if he could see me through the glare of the lights, and his expression shifted. I raised my hand in a clear gesture, signaling he couldn't come in, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, his face twisted, a scowl replacing the vague expression he'd worn earlier. He staggered forward, gripping the handle and giving it a hard yank, testing the lock with a force that made the door rattle. I felt my heart lurch as he realized he was locked out. His expression darkened, anger flashing in his eyes, and he pounded on the door, each hit sending vibrations through the glass. My pulse quickened, fear creeping up my spine as he continued to slam his fists against the door, the sound echoing through the empty station. I tried to keep calm, but the intensity of his rage left me frozen in place, staring at him through the glass. His frustration grew with each passing second, his movements turning more erratic as he pounded on the door, shouting incoherently. I could see his face twisted with anger, his eyes wild as he continued to ram the door, demanding to be let in. His voice was muffled but harsh, an unintelligible growl that sent chills down my spine. I stepped back, feeling the distance between us shrink as he pressed against the door, his face almost level with mine through the glass. My mind raced, searching for options, a way to diffuse the situation, or at the very least, a way to put more distance between us. I glanced around, realizing there was little else I could do. I was trapped behind the counter with no escape, my only protection the thin pane of glass that separated us. The intensity of his gaze bore into me, his fists still hammering the door as he muttered and snarled. My hands shook as I reached for the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on me, making every second feel stretched and surreal. With a steadying breath, I finally dialed 911, forcing my voice to stay calm as I explained the situation. The operator's voice was reassuring, asking for details, but even as I spoke, my eyes stayed glued to the man at the door. As soon as I mentioned the police, something shifted. He paused, his gaze sharp as he seemed to register my words. For a moment, we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff, the weight of his anger pressing against me even through the glass. Then, without a word, he turned, stumbling back a step, his expression unreadable. I watched as he took another step, his movements slow, almost reluctant, before he finally turned and broke into an uneven run, disappearing into the shadows beyond the parking lot. The silence that followed was deafening, the echo of his banging still lingering in the air as I stood there, phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the police to arrive. Relief mixed with the residual fear, a strange blend of emotions that left me feeling dazed. The darkness outside seemed to press in, making the gas station feel smaller, more vulnerable, as though he might reappear at any moment, his shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the lights. The police arrived a few minutes later, their presence bringing a measure of comfort, but the unease remained. They searched the area, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they scanned the lot and the surrounding streets, but they found no trace of him. After I described the encounter, they reassured me that he likely wouldn't return, that I'd done the right thing by calling. But their words did little to ease the residual fear clinging to me like a shadow. Once they left, I was left alone again, the empty silence settling over the gas station. As the hours ticked by, I tried to resume my routine, filling shelves and sweeping floors, but the lingering dread was inescapable. Though the night ended uneventfully, a part of me knew I'd never feel the same about those silent hours. Working late shifts at the gas station had always been a quiet affair. Being right off the highway, the station saw its fair share of travelers during the day, but by evening it was mostly empty, leaving me alone with the hum of the lights and the distant sounds of passing cars. Around 9:30, I noticed a car pulling up to the furthest pump. Nothing unusual about that at first. The car idled there, its engine softly rumbling, but minutes passed and no one got out. I waited, expecting to see someone step out to pump gas, but the car just sat there, like it was waiting for something. The interior was dark, the windows tinted enough that I couldn't see who was inside. Still, I thought little of it, deciding it was probably just someone taking a moment to rest. But as time wore on and the car remained, a slight prickling sense of dread started to build. The clock crept closer to closing, and I decided to turn off the station's lights as a signal. Maybe they hadn't realized we were about to close. I reached for the switch, flipping off the neon signs that glowed above the pumps, and watched as the gas station went dark. But even with the lights off, the car didn't budge. I felt my skin crawl, a growing discomfort pressing down. As I stood there, unsure of what to do, I picked up my phone, dialing my boyfriend to tell him what was happening. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just another car on the edge of an empty lot, but it didn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. With my boyfriend still on the line, I moved to the small office at the back of the station to check the security cameras. I switched on the monitor, scrolling through the angles until I saw the car again. There it was, parked at that distant pump with its engine still running. But now, something else caught my eye, the way the car was angled. It was parked in a way that concealed its license plate, the back end turned away from the station and pointed toward the open road. I felt my stomach tighten. Was this deliberate? The thought made my fingers tremble slightly as I held the phone. My boyfriend's voice came through the line, calm and steady, urging me to finish up and leave. "Just get in your car and go," he said, his tone firm. "Don't wait around." I nodded, realizing he was right. I couldn't linger here any longer. Whatever was going on, I needed to leave before it got any worse. I prepared to close up, steeling myself for the walk outside. The front door could only be locked from the outside, meaning I'd have to turn my back to the lot, to that car and whoever was inside it. It wasn't a comforting thought. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my pepper spray and headed toward the front, gripping it tightly in my hand. My heart beat faster with every step as I reached the door, aware of how exposed I was about to be. With the pepper spray clutched tightly in my hand, I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The night air was thick and silent, amplifying each small sound around me. My heartbeat felt like a steady drum as I moved to lock the door, my back turned to the lot and to that car. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers unsteady. Then, just as I slid the key into the lock, I heard it, a car door creaking open behind me. The sound was soft but unmistakable, and it sent a cold jolt through me. I didn't dare turn around. My hands moved faster, twisting the key and securing the door. My senses heightened as I focused on the faint shuffle of footsteps approaching. I could feel the presence of someone nearby, their figure drifting closer in the dark. A man in a baseball hat, his features shadowed by the dim light, had emerged from the car and was now walking toward me. With the door finally locked, I didn't waste another second. I bolted toward my car, gripping my pepper spray tightly, ready to use it if I had to. The man's slow approach didn't break. He kept walking, calm and deliberate. I could feel his gaze on me, a weight that pressed harder with each step I took. I managed to reach my car, slipping inside and locking the doors. A glance back confirmed he was still there, close enough that I could see his silhouette against the distant lights. My breath came shallow as I turned the key in the ignition, my hands shaking. I had to get away from here. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The man stood still for a moment, watching as I drove off. But then he moved, turning back to his car and getting in. The headlights flared to life, and my heart sank as I watched his car roll out of the lot, falling into line behind me. He was following me. Panic rose like a wave, tightening my grip on the wheel as I tried to keep my breathing steady. My boyfriend was still on the line, his voice in my ear, urging me to stay calm and get to safety. Every turn I took, he followed. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, each passing mile feeling like an eternity as I tried to put distance between us. But no matter how fast I drove, he stayed close behind, never dropping back, as though he was locked onto my trail. The empty highway offered no cover, no other cars to create a barrier between us. My mind raced through my options, but each one seemed as hopeless as the last. There was no way I could lead him home. He couldn't know where I lived. Then a thought struck me, and I knew what I had to do. I shifted lanes, steering toward the nearest exit that would lead me straight to the police station. It was my only chance. The tension in my body was almost unbearable as I drove, glancing back every few seconds to see the headlights still fixed on me, closer than ever. I told my boyfriend my plan, and he stayed with me, his voice steady, grounding me through the terror. I sped toward the station, hoping it would be enough to end this chase. The police station's lights appeared ahead, casting a reassuring glow against the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of safety within reach as I made the final turn into the lot. As I approached the building, the headlights behind me grew brighter, signaling the man's approach, his persistence even now sending a chill through me. But the moment I neared the police station entrance, I noticed a sudden shift. The headlights veered sharply to the side, the car swerving past me and speeding away into the night. The relief was immediate, flooding over me in waves as I watched his car disappear into the shadows, leaving only the quiet, empty road in its wake. He was gone. I pulled into a parking space, my body tense, unwilling to relax until I was absolutely sure. For a few moments I sat there, clutching the wheel and staring into the darkness, half expecting those headlights to return, but they didn't. I was safe, the station's bright lights and the distant hum of activity anchoring me back to reality. After a few deep breaths, I finally managed to collect myself, allowing the lingering fear to settle as I considered what could have happened. My boyfriend's voice was still on the line, filled with worry, but now tinged with relief. I explained that the man had driven off, that I was finally safe. I ended the call and sat in my car for a few more minutes, letting the steady presence of the police station bring me fully back from the edge of fear. Eventually, I started the engine again, feeling the grip of the night's events begin to fade as I left the lot. The drive home was swift, my heart still heavy, but now overshadowed by a sense of gratitude for the quick thinking that had brought me here. Working the overnight shift at the gas station had always brought a mix of quiet and tension. There was a strange kind of isolation that settled in after midnight, when the flow of customers slowed to a trickle, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of a car speeding down the highway. I was alone, as usual, passing the hours with mundane tasks, trying to ignore the stillness that filled the empty space around me. I told myself that it was just another night, no different from the ones before, and that soon enough, the morning shift would arrive, bringing the normal rhythm back to the station. It was just after 2 a.m. when he walked in. I noticed him immediately. A tall man in his late 30s or early 40s, he glanced around briefly before approaching the counter. His voice was low and casual as he asked if he could use the restroom. I nodded, directing him to the door in the back. It was an unusual request for this hour, but I tried not to think too much of it. He disappeared down the narrow hallway, and I resumed my routine, my mind wandering as I waited for him to finish. But even as I tried to focus, there was a faint sense of unease gnawing at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. A few minutes later, he reappeared, this time lingering by the counter. He seemed hesitant, shifting his weight before finally speaking up. "Hey, I'm having trouble with the gas pump," he said, his tone casual but with an edge I couldn't ignore. "Could you come outside and help me?" The words hung in the air, sending a ripple of discomfort through me. I knew the pump system well enough to know that it was simple, almost foolproof, and hardly ever required assistance. Still, I glanced down at the register to check for any indication of an error. Nothing. No record, no message. It was as though he hadn't even tried. If there had been an issue, the register would have displayed an error code. But there was nothing, only a blank screen. I looked up at him, feeling the first real prickling of suspicion. Something wasn't right. But I kept my expression neutral, nodding as I explained the payment process to him. "You can pay inside," I said, my voice calm, as if to mask the unease building inside me. He agreed, taking out his wallet and paying in cash. But just as soon as he handed me the money, he started again, insisting that he still didn't understand the pump and that I should come outside. My hands tightened around the register as I considered his request, feeling a subtle tension building in the silence between us. I knew then, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that I wouldn't be stepping outside that night. He kept standing there, leaning slightly forward, as though trying to draw me out from behind the counter. "It's really confusing," he said, his voice almost pleading. "If you just came outside, I'm sure it would be easier." I could feel the weight of his gaze, the expectation hanging thick in the air as he waited for my answer. I gripped the edge of the counter, a quiet tension gathering inside me. Everything about his request felt wrong, every instinct in me screaming not to step outside. I gave him a firm but polite response, explaining that store policy prohibited me from leaving the building during overnight shifts. It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. "I really can't leave the store," I said, keeping my tone steady, "but I can guide you through it from here." His face twitched, and he offered a faint smile, raising a hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I'm not scary," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The words sounded odd, as though they were meant to make me feel at ease, but instead they had the opposite effect, sharpening my discomfort. I kept my position behind the counter, repeating the steps to operate the pump in a calm, measured voice. For a moment, he just stared at me, and the silence seemed to stretch. Eventually, he sighed, glancing toward the door as if weighing his options. "All right," he mumbled, turning and heading out toward the pump. I watched him closely, a chill creeping up my spine. I knew I had made the right choice not to follow him outside, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't really given up. As he walked out, I moved to the side of the counter where I could get a better view of the lot through the store's large windows. I watched as he approached the pump, and to my surprise, he lifted the nozzle and began filling his tank without hesitation. My breath caught in my chest, a cold realization settling in as I watched him handle the pump without any apparent difficulty. There had been no issue with it at all. The whole time, he had known exactly how to use it. He'd been pretending, trying to lure me outside for reasons I didn't want to think about. The man's movements were calm, almost routine, as he finished filling up his car. I kept my eyes on him, waiting to see if he would make another attempt to approach the store. But he simply returned the nozzle, got back into his car, and drove away, vanishing into the darkness of the highway as if nothing had happened. I stayed by the counter, watching the empty lot, feeling the unease settle deeper within me. The threat was gone, but the silence he left behind seemed heavier now, more foreboding. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the night. I tried to piece together his intentions, wondering what would have happened if I had stepped outside. The unease lingered, wrapping itself around me like a heavy fog, and I knew that whatever his plan had been, I had narrowly escaped it.